Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight we'll share quiet stories from Japanese Reddit, translated and retold slowly for sleep. Settle in, dim the lights, and let your breath find its own pace. Welcome, and thank you for choosing to spend this quiet evening here, in this space that has been set aside just for you. Tonight, as you settle in and dim the lights, you are invited simply to rest and to let the day release its hold on you, allowing your body and your mind to grow still and heavy with ease. Over the next 2 hours or so, you will hear 7 stories, each one drawn from the real anonymous voices of Japanese internet forums, places where ordinary people share their lives, their struggles, their small confusions and their quiet sorrows, without giving their names. These are not dramatic stories crafted for effect, they are personal accounts written by real people who simply needed to set something down and be heard, and they carry the kind of quiet honesty that is rare and worth carrying gently. The stories have been translated from Japanese and retold in slow, unhurried English, shaped for the kind of listening that happens at the very edge of sleep, when the mind begins to soften and wander without effort. You will hear about families and neighbors, about workplaces and difficult relationships, about moments that stayed with someone long enough that they felt the need to write them down and offer them to strangers in the night. Some of these stories carry a quiet melancholy, some hold a gentle strangeness, and some carry a warmth that lingers long after the words themselves have faded into silence. You do not need to follow every detail, and you do not need to remember the names or the timelines or the small turns that appear along the way, because none of that matters here tonight. If you find yourself drifting before a story ends, or before the next one has properly begun, that is exactly right, that is the whole intention, and you are doing exactly as you should. The narration this evening has been crafted with the help of AI, working to carry these voices across language and distance with a certain gentleness and care. So find a comfortable position now, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow the sound of these voices to become something like rain against a window in the distance, present and soft and requiring nothing of you at all. Let's begin. She was still very young when she learned that some losses arrive without warning, and that the world continues its slow turning even when a child's life has been altered beyond recognition. Her name, in the story as it was told and retold on quiet evenings, was Maruko, and she had been in middle school, small, serious, still growing into herself, when the accident took both of her parents in a single, wordless afternoon. What she was left with was her grandmother, a woman who had spent her working life in a government office, steady and unhurried, the kind of person who folded things carefully before putting them away. Her grandmother's world was modest, a small pension after retirement, a home without excess, and yet Maruko would say, later, that she had been happy there, genuinely and quietly happy, in the way that children sometimes are when they are simply loved without condition. Her grandfather had passed before Maruko was born, so she had no memory of him, only the sense of a shape that had once been present and was now simply absent, like furniture rearranged long ago. The two of them lived together through Maruko's high school years, her grandmother waking early to prepare the morning rice, Maruko coming home in the late afternoon light to the smell of simmering broth, and they were content, in that particular way of people who have learned not to ask for more than what the day provides. When Maruko graduated from high school, it was through a connection of her grandmother's, a friend from her grandmother's own school days, a woman who would later become the person Maruko thought of as her grandmother-in-law, that a position opened at a small family company, and Maruko went to work there, hoping quietly that this might ease some of the weight her grandmother had been carrying for so many years. She had been working there only a short while when her grandmother became ill. The illness was not announced dramatically, it arrived in the slow, persistent way that serious illness sometimes does, settling in before anyone quite realizes it has come to stay. After roughly half a year of careful, quiet struggle, medicines and appointments, and the particular fatigue of sustained hoping, her grandmother passed away, and Maruko found herself standing at the edge of something she had not fully anticipated, a world with no remaining family of her own. The funeral arrangements, which might have overwhelmed a young woman standing alone in shock, were handled by the family at the company where she worked, the grandfather and grandmother of that family, the owners, kind and capable people who stepped in without being asked and managed everything with a quiet competence that left Maruko feeling both grateful and faintly bewildered. Not long after the funeral, a stranger appeared, someone claiming to be a distant relation through her grandmother's side, who informed Maruko, in tones that carried little warmth, that the house belonged to them now, and that she would need to find somewhere else to live. Maruko was very young, and she had no guarantor, no relative to vouch for her, no family name to write on an application form, and in Japan, where such practical anchors matter enormously, this left her in a position that could easily have become desperate. But the family at the company, the older couple, the grandmother-in-law and grandfather-in-law she would one day call her own, had an apartment in their possession, and they offered it to her without making her feel that she owed them anything in particular. Beyond the apartment itself, the grandmother-in-law took to inviting Maruko to join the family for dinner in the evenings, and she began preparing a bento lunch for Maruko to take to work each day, and Maruko would later describe this period as one in which she was, in some ways, more cared for than she had perhaps ever realized she could be. The grandmother-in-law, with her gentle humor, used to say that having just 3 older people sitting around the dinner table was too quiet, and that Maruko made the table brighter simply by being present there, and that if she ever found a boyfriend she should feel absolutely free to say so, and to put the boyfriend first without the slightest hesitation. This was the household into which Maruko had quietly settled, borrowing its warmth, eating its dinners, gratefully receiving its lunches, when the family's son came home from Tokyo. He was an only child, the eldest son, and he had been living in Tokyo for 4 years, working there in the particular anonymous way that young professionals sometimes do, building a life in one city while another city waits for them without complaint. He had returned because a transfer had been arranged. He would now be working in the Kansai region, not far from the family home, and he moved back into the orbit of the household with the easy familiarity of someone who had always known where the cups were kept and which floorboards tended to settle at night. At the time of his return, he was married, and Maruko registered this fact with the mild neutrality of someone noting a detail that does not particularly concern them, and she continued eating her dinners and receiving her lunches and going about her work in the unhurried rhythm she had established. His wife, however, found that she did not like the Kansai region, preferring Tokyo, where she had roots, and where the city matched the particular shape of the life she had imagined for herself. Within the year following the transfer, she returned to Tokyo, and after that, in the quiet, paperwork-heavy way that such things tend to unfold, the marriage ended. During the period of that transition, the untidiness that precedes the formal settling of things, the husband began eating more frequently at his parents' home, and Maruko was often there too, and over the course of many shared dinners and many evenings, they began to talk. It happened that he held a professional qualification that Maruko had been working toward, and in the after-dinner hours he would sometimes sit with her and explain the practice problems, patient and unhurried, and she found his explanations clear and easy to follow. Somewhere in that stretch of evenings, study sessions becoming conversations, conversations becoming walks, walks becoming the occasional film, something shifted between them, in the slow, undramatic way that things sometimes do when 2 people spend enough time in the same gentle light. He proposed, and she said yes, and the yes arrived in her chest with a warmth she had not expected, a warmth that felt like something she had been waiting for without quite knowing she had been waiting. When she told the older couple that she intended to marry their son, their reaction was not, as one might expect, simple celebration. Both the grandfather-in-law and grandmother-in-law looked at her with expressions of genuine concern and asked, seriously, whether she was sure that Maruko, the name they had used for her for so long that it had become something warm and familiar, was not perhaps too good for a man who had, after all, been through a divorce. It was the kind of worry that came from genuine affection rather than from any disapproval of Maruko herself, and she was moved by it, in the way one is moved by love that has already been quietly demonstrated long before it is openly expressed. They married, and moved into an apartment near the family home, and Maruko continued working at the family company, and they fell into the comfortable rhythm of a life built between two households, eating dinner at his parents' home 2 or 3 times each week, the kind of arrangement that works best when everyone involved actually likes one another. His father was a man who seemed unhurried in his work, content to let things proceed at a measured pace, and his mother was the kind of woman who noticed things, who noticed when a plate was emptier than usual, or when someone at the table was quieter than they should be, or when a face that was usually composed had begun to hold something carefully behind it. For a time, the arrangement was good, and Maruko found herself, for the first time in a long while, living inside a life that had the texture of belonging. And then came the second transfer. It was arranged with a speed that left little room for adjustment, and this time the destination was Sendai, far to the north, a city known for its particular kind of cold, its long winters, and the snow that arrives early and stays for a time that surprises people from southern Japan. Maruko had grown up in Kansai and had never really left it, and the distance from everything she knew felt significant in a way she found difficult to put into words, so she did not try to articulate it, and simply packed what they needed and followed him north, the way people sometimes do when they are not quite sure what else to do. His work in Sendai was demanding, and he was often out late, coming home in the early hours of the morning after long evenings that had included, as was common in certain working lives in Japan, the particular companionship of colleagues gathered around a table with drinks, and he would come in quietly, moving carefully through the darkened apartment. Maruko spent her days in the apartment, watching the cold settle over the city from the window, watching the particular grey light of a northern winter afternoon, watching the long Sendai evenings arrive earlier and earlier as the season pushed forward. She found herself thinking, on those evenings, about the dinner table in Osaka, about the sound of the grandmother-in-law's voice calling her in from the other room, about the smell of miso soup and the comfortable weight of a shared meal, and the thoughts were fond, but they ached in the way that fond thoughts sometimes do when they describe something very far away. What was happening to her during those months, she would reflect much later, was probably something like a mild sadness that had taken up residence, the particular heaviness that can settle on a person who has been removed from every source of warmth they had carefully, quietly accumulated over years. She had not yet named what she was experiencing, and she was managing in the way that people sometimes manage, which is to say that she was present each day, but she was doing it alone, and the days were long. One evening, around 8 o'clock, the grandmother-in-law called, and Maruko answered, and when the grandmother-in-law asked how she was, something gave way in Maruko's chest, and she found herself crying, not in an alarming way, but in the quiet, helpless way that happens when loneliness has been held in for too long and the voice on the other end of the line is too kind for the holding to continue. She said, through the tears, that her husband had not come home again, that the evenings were very long, that she was alone, and the grandmother-in-law listened without interrupting, in the attentive way of someone who understands that listening is sometimes the most important and complete thing you can offer. The call ended, and Maruko went to bed, and her husband came home sometime after midnight, moving carefully in the dark, and she was not quite awake enough to tell him about the call, and so she didn't. The following morning, just after 6, the doorbell rang. Maruko went to the door still carrying the slow, cotton-soft heaviness of not quite enough sleep, opened it, and found the grandmother-in-law standing in the corridor outside, composed and purposeful, wearing the expression of someone who has done what needed doing and does not particularly feel the need to explain herself at length. She had left Osaka the night before, after the phone call ended, and had taken the Shinkansen to Tokyo and then an overnight bus through the darkness to Sendai, arriving at the door of a cold apartment in a city that was not her own, because the phone call had told her everything she needed to know. Her son was at the breakfast table, still half asleep, and his mother spoke to him directly and without much preamble, telling him that if his wife was lonely and uncertain in an unfamiliar place, and he was not present to give her steadiness, then he was not doing what was expected, and that this was precisely what she had worried about before they came north. She reminded him that Maruko had no family home to return to if things became difficult, not the way his first wife had had somewhere to go, and that he had been told this, and that he needed to think carefully about what that meant. She then turned to Maruko and said, gently, that a taxi was waiting outside, and that they were going back to Osaka, and that his father and his grandmother were waiting there too, and that he could see to his own breakfast. Maruko found that she was crying again, though she could not have precisely named the reason, whether from gratitude, or from the relief of no longer having to manage alone, or from the simple, overwhelming fact of being so completely and unexpectedly claimed by someone who had every practical reason not to bother. On the train south, passing through the mountains of Kizo and the flat farmland of Gifu, watching the landscape change through the window from northern grey to something warmer, she cried again, more quietly this time, and the grandmother-in-law sat beside her without saying very much, which was exactly and entirely what was needed. Back in the family home in Osaka, surrounded by the particular warmth of a house that had always been generous, Maruko was taken to see a local doctor. She had become noticeably thin, and the grandmother-in-law had observed this carefully, and it was not a thing to be left unaddressed. It was at this appointment, in the mild, slightly antiseptic calm of a neighborhood clinic, that something further was discovered. Maruko was pregnant. The news arrived slowly, the way significant things sometimes do, requiring a moment or two before it could fully settle and be believed. She felt a small embarrassment at not having noticed sooner. The changes in her body had been so thoroughly overwritten by the disruption of the move, by the cold, by the long evenings, that she had not paused long enough to attend to herself as carefully as she might have. The grandparents-in-law received the news with warm and uncomplicated joy, the kind of joy that does not require any performance and that fills a room simply by being genuine, and they said they were very happy, and they clearly were. They also said, with the gentle firmness of people who have made a decision they intend to stand by, that they were not comfortable sending her back to Sendai in her current state, and so it was arranged that she would remain in Osaka for a time, and her husband would come back to have the conversations that clearly needed to be had. He came back, and the conversations were serious ones, and his parents were clear with him in the measured but firm way of people who love you and simply expect better, and he sat and listened, which was perhaps the most useful thing he could have done. Maruko felt, more than once during that period, that his parents were so thoroughly and openly on her side that she almost felt sorry for him, which was not an expected feeling and which she found somewhat difficult to interpret. At one point, when he said, in the slightly deflated way of a man who feels he is being managed from all sides, that the house was his, not Maruko's family home, and that he wasn't certain it was entirely fair for everyone to be so firmly aligned against him, his mother replied with a calm and rather precise piece of observation. She told him that a son who had left for university and rarely returned, who had allowed contact to become infrequent, who had not always remembered the occasions the family observed, that son had been, in practical terms, less present in the daily life of the household than Maruko, who had sat at their table for years, who had remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every holiday they valued, and who was now carrying their grandchild. She invited him to consider, quietly and without hurry, which of them had more genuinely been like a child to the family in recent memory, and suggested he take his time thinking it over before saying anything further along those lines. There was a silence after that, the kind that follows a very accurate observation, a silence with its own particular quality of weight and clarity. Over the weeks that followed, in the warmth of the family home and the gradual return of her appetite and her composure, Maruko began to feel more like herself, and the pregnancy settled into its own quiet rhythm, and she spent her mornings in the slow domestic comfort of a household that had arranged itself around her without making her feel like a burden or an afterthought. Something shifted in her husband during that time too, a kind of stock-taking, perhaps, a pause long enough to see clearly, and he announced, after some reflection, that he wanted to leave his company and help with his parents' business instead. His father's response was not simple approval. The grandfather-in-law told him that if he was serious about joining the family company, he would first need to spend at least 3 years learning from the ground up at a different firm, working as someone who knew very little and was there to learn, before taking on any familiarity in the family business. He agreed, and made the change at an age when such changes are neither easy nor guaranteed to go well, and he went to work each day without complaint, and in time, in the slow, gradual way of things that are built properly, he came to stand beside his father in the work his father had spent a lifetime building. When the time came for Maruko's pregnancy to reach its conclusion, the particular landmark of a first birth, which carries its own weight of the unknown, the grandmother-in-law and grandfather-in-law accompanied her to the prenatal classes, and to the checkups at the hospital, sitting beside her in waiting rooms and following along in the instructional materials with a patient, genuine attention. They acknowledged openly that their generation had done things differently, that the approaches to childbirth and infant care had changed, and that what mattered now was Maruko's comfort and her confidence, and they followed her lead with a grace that she found, in retrospect, deeply moving. She delivered safely, and the baby was healthy, and afterward she found herself sitting in the quiet of a room in Osaka, holding something new, and thinking about all the things that had led to this moment. She thought, in particular, about the doorbell at 6 o'clock on a cold morning in Sendai, and about the woman standing in the corridor outside, and she thought that she did not know what she would have done, or who she would have become, if that doorbell had not rung. She thought this not in the dramatic way, not as a catastrophe narrowly avoided, but in the quieter way that comes when you look back across a series of small kindnesses and realize that, taken together, they constituted something very large and very enduring. The grandmother-in-law was someone Maruko called her mother now, fully, in the way that matters most, which is the way of presence and intention rather than the way of biology or paperwork. She said that this woman was the best mother in the world, and she meant it simply, the way you say something you have understood for a long time and no longer need to examine. And so, for tonight, the story comes gently to rest here, in a kitchen in Osaka, in the late afternoon of an ordinary day, where the kettle is beginning its soft sound on the stove, and a woman who once had no one is sitting at a table surrounded by the warm, low noise of a family that chose her, and whom she chose in return. Outside, the city moves through the hour in its usual unhurried way, and the light through the window is the amber light of early evening, the kind that turns ordinary surfaces golden and makes a room feel like a place that has been arrived at after a long and winding journey. The tatami along the corridor carries the faint, grassy scent it always carries in the evening, and somewhere in the back of the house a door opens and closes softly, and a child makes a small sound, and then the house is quiet again. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way a dream fades when you reach for it, softly, without resistance. There is no hurry here. If you like, take a slow breath now, feeling the weight of your body settle a little deeper into the quiet beneath you. You have nowhere to be. The night holds everything gently, and so do we. When you are ready, and there is truly no rush, our next story takes us to a quieter household, where the hours move slowly and the air carries the faint scent of cedar and old paper, and where, beneath the surface of ordinary days, something tender and unexpected was waiting to be found. She wrote the letter in November, when the maples had already let go of their color and the air outside her window smelled of cold soil and something older, something she could not quite name. He would not know any of this until the letter arrived, months later, slipped into his mailbox on an ordinary morning when the light was low and the street was still and his neighbor's cat sat without moving on the low wall. Her name was on the envelope, written in her handwriting, small and careful and tilted slightly to the left, as it had always been, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment with the letter held loosely in both hands, the morning cold settling around him. He had not seen her name written anywhere in many years, and the sight of it made him very still inside, in a way he had not expected and could not quite explain. He went inside slowly, and he set the letter on the low table in his main room, and he filled the kettle, and he waited for the water to warm. The room around him was quiet in the way of winter mornings, the faint creak of the building settling, the distant sound of a train somewhere below the hill, the small, steady sound of the kettle beginning its work. He poured the tea without hurrying, and he carried the cup to the table, and he sat down on the cushion he kept beside the window, and he looked at the envelope for a while before he opened it. It had been 10 years, or very nearly so, 10 years since the last time he had seen her face, 10 years since the papers were signed and the apartment they had shared was divided into boxes and silences. He had told himself, over those 10 years, that he had made peace with it, that the divorce had been a mutual thing, a quiet dissolution arrived at by two people who had simply grown into different shapes. But the letter in his hand suggested something else, something he had perhaps always known was waiting to be said, and he unfolded the pages carefully, the way one handles something that has been kept for a long time. The paper was thin, and it carried the faint trace of something floral, not perfume exactly, but the ghost of the dried flowers she had always kept on her windowsill, the one she would replace each season without fail. She began the letter simply, writing that she hoped this found him well, that she had been uncertain whether to write it at all, and that she had started it many times over the preceding years and stopped each time before the words could settle into anything real. But now, she wrote, the season had turned, and something in the turning of it had made her want, at last, to speak. He read slowly, as the morning outside his window moved from the flat grey of early hours to something warmer and more golden, as the tea cooled quietly in the cup beside his hand. She wrote about the day they had met, he in his second year of work, she still finishing her studies, about the small restaurant near the station where they had shared a meal they could barely afford, talking until the staff had begun to fold the napkins and arrange the chairs. She wrote that she had thought of that evening many times in the years since, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of wonder at how young they had been, how certain of things they could not possibly have understood. And then, gently, she turned the letter toward the years of the marriage itself, and he found himself setting the pages down for a moment and breathing slowly before he continued. She wrote that she had been unwell during the final year they were together, not in the way of hospitals and doctors at first, but in a quieter way, a slow tiredness that had settled into her bones and simply would not lift. She had not told him, she wrote, because she had not yet found the words for it, and because she had not yet understood herself what it was, and because she had been afraid of what the telling might change between them. He sat with that for a long moment, the image of her in the apartment they had shared, going about the mornings he remembered, carrying something she had chosen not to name aloud. The tatami floor beneath him was the same warm, pale color it had always been in winter light, and he pressed his palms flat against it for a moment, as if grounding himself before going on. She wrote that the illness had not been dangerous in the end, that it had been managed and treated, and that she was well now, but that at the time, in the middle of it, she had felt a kind of fear she had not known in herself before. And that fear, she wrote, had made her smaller, had made her feel that she was becoming a weight upon the life they were building together, had made her believe that the kindest thing she could offer him was to step away before she asked too much. He read that sentence twice, and then a third time, and the morning was very quiet around him. She had not left because she had stopped caring, she wrote, she had left because she cared too much, and had not known how to say so, and had mistaken her silence for a kind of generosity rather than a kind of distance. He thought of the conversations they had shared in those last months together, the ones that had felt, even as they were happening, like two people talking about different things without understanding why. He had believed, then, that they had simply run out of the particular patience that long marriages require, that the growing quiet between them was ordinary and inevitable, the kind that settled in with years. He had not known that she was holding something heavier beneath her quietness, that her withdrawal had been a specific kind of silence, the silence of someone making a decision, slowly and alone, night after night. The letter moved then into a memory she wanted to share with him, a small one, she wrote, but one that had stayed with her through all the years since. She wrote of a Sunday in their second year together, when they had taken the train to the coast and walked along the breakwater in the cold wind, and he had bought her a cup of corn soup from a vending machine at the station. It had been an entirely unremarkable afternoon, she wrote, but she had returned to it often over the years, the grey sea, the wind off the water, the warmth of the cup between her palms, and him walking beside her without any agenda other than the simple fact of being there. She had been happy then, she wrote, in a way that was uncomplicated and light, and she had not always known how to say so at the time, and she regretted that she had not said it more. He looked up from the page and out the window, where the winter branches of the tree in the courtyard were bare and still against the pale morning sky, and he thought he understood exactly what she meant. There had been many such afternoons in those years, afternoons that had felt entirely ordinary while they were happening, that he had not thought to hold on to with any particular care, that lived now only as a kind of general warmth, vague and without edges. She wrote about the years after the divorce carefully, not dwelling in them, but offering them the way one might show someone a map of a journey they had not taken. She had moved to another city, she did not say which one, and she had continued her work, and she had taken care of her health, and slowly, across the seasons, the year that had unsettled her had receded into the ordinary past. She had not married again, she wrote, not because the divorce had made her afraid of marriage, but because she had found a life that suited her in its quieter shape. She had a small apartment, she wrote, with a south-facing window where she grew herbs through the winter months, and a bicycle she used on clear mornings, and a few close friends who had known her since well before. In the evenings, she wrote, she sometimes read, or listened to music, or simply sat with her tea and the sound of the city below, and found that this was more than sufficient for a life. She wrote that she was, on balance, content, and that writing that word felt strange to her, because she had not always been certain she was allowed to feel it, after everything, but that she was, and that she had been for some years now. He found, reading that sentence, that something he had not known he was holding began, quietly, to ease a small tightness beneath his ribs that had perhaps been there for the whole of the decade without ever announcing itself. He had wondered sometimes, over those years, whether she had been all right, not constantly, and not with any urgency he could act upon, but in the way one wonders about someone who was once very close, a quiet background wondering that never resolved itself into action. The letter answered that wondering, and he felt grateful to it simply for doing so. She wrote then about why she had decided, finally, to send it, and her reason was a simple one, though it had taken her a long time to understand it clearly. She had not been able to sleep one night in the previous autumn, and she had lain awake turning over all the things that had been left unsaid between them, not with grief, not with any sharpness, but with a kind of quiet, unhurried attention. She had understood, lying there in the dark, that what she had wanted all along was simply for him to know the true account, not to excuse what had happened, not to undo it, but to give him a more accurate version than the one they had both been carrying. Because the version she feared he had was this, that she had left because she no longer loved him, or because she had wanted something different, or because she had found some fault in him that she could not overlook. And none of that had been true, she wrote, not any part of it, and the thought that he might have spent a decade carrying a mistaken version of their story was the thing that had, at last, made her take up the pen. He read that slowly, and outside the window the light had shifted to the thin, clear brightness of late morning, and somewhere beyond the glass a bird moved through the bare branches of the courtyard tree. He had been, he understood now, drawing a map entirely in the dark, and the map had served him well enough to live by, but it had not been the right map, and he had never known until this morning. There was something strange and releasing in that, in holding a wrong story in your hands and feeling it come, gently and slowly, apart. The final pages of the letter were shorter and calmer, more like a soft closing than any kind of continuation. She wrote that she hoped he had been well, that she hoped the years had been kind to him, and that she hoped he had found the things he had been looking for when they were still young enough to be looking for things. She did not ask him to write back, she wrote, though she would not be unhappy if he chose to, but she wanted him to understand that the letter was not a request, and not an opening toward anything, except perhaps toward a cleaner kind of quiet. She had wanted only for the silence between them to be a true silence rather than one filled with unspoken things, and she hoped that this letter might, in some small measure, accomplish that. She signed it with her given name, the way she had always signed the letters she wrote him when they were young, before the quiet formality of marriage had, without either of them noticing, made them more careful with each other. He sat with the letter in his hands for a long time after he had finished reading, the pages resting in his open palms, the winter room very still around him. The tea in his cup had long since gone cold, and the light in the room had changed twice while he had been reading, and his cushion had left its soft impression in the tatami beneath him. He thought of her in her south-facing apartment, growing herbs in small pots on the sill, thyme, perhaps, or something with a soft, green smell, the winter sun arriving at an angle he could not quite picture from where he sat today. He thought of her writing the letter in November, sitting at whatever table she kept for such things, choosing each word with the care she had always brought to things that mattered to her. There was a version of himself, he understood now, that had lived through the last 10 years with a wound he had never examined closely, had healed around it rather than through it, and had come, over time, to regard the scar as simply part of the shape of himself. The letter had not removed the scar, but it had described it more accurately, had given it a name and a source, and somehow that alone was enough. He thought of the afternoon on the breakwater she had described, the grey sea, the corn soup from the vending machine, the cold wind moving in off the water, and he found that he did remember it, had always remembered it somewhere, even when he had not known he was. He had not visited that memory in years, perhaps not in the whole of the decade, but it had been there all along, intact and unhurried, waiting in some quiet room of himself he had simply not entered for a long time. He folded the letter carefully, along its original creases, and he returned it to the envelope, and he held it for a moment before setting it back on the table beside the cold cup. He did not know yet whether he would write back. He thought that he would, eventually, when the reading had settled in him enough that he would know what he wanted to say, but for now the letter simply rested where it was, and that felt like enough. He thought of forgiveness, and then he thought that forgiveness was perhaps not quite the right word for what he was feeling. It was something less formal than that, something more like the slow, quiet releasing of a breath he had been holding for a very long time without knowing it. The room was the same room it had always been, and the tree in the courtyard was the same tree, and the winter light moved across the tatami in the same unhurried way it always did, and yet something had shifted, in the way that things shift when a question that has been waiting a long time finally receives its answer. He thought of how rarely we receive the gift of a correction, how rarely someone crosses the years simply to give us a true version of a story we have been carrying wrong for all that time. She had done that for him, and he understood that it had taken something from her to do it, and he felt grateful in a way that was quiet and deep and did not need to be expressed to be entirely real. Outside, the winter afternoon had arranged itself while he had been reading, the light softening already toward the early dark that came in these months, the bare tree casting long, pale shadows across the courtyard floor below. He rose from the cushion slowly, and he carried the cold cup to the kitchen, and he rinsed it without hurrying, and he looked out at the sky through the small kitchen window, and the sky had settled into a gentle, even gray. She had been unwell, and she had been afraid, and she had made the choice she had believed was the right one with what she had known at the time, and he had lived in the story that remained, and done his best with it, and that, too, he now understood, had been enough. There was a gentleness to understanding this, a gentleness that did not ask the years to have been other than they were, but that sat alongside them now without resistance, without the old unanswered weight. He stood at the kitchen window for a while, watching the shadows in the courtyard lengthen, listening to the quiet of the building around him, feeling the cold air that came through the glass in a thin, even current. He thought that he would read the letter again in the morning, when the first reading had had time to settle more completely, when the words would have found the places inside him they were meant for. For now, the room was still, and the light was low and soft, and somewhere beyond the window the city was moving through its ordinary evening, carrying nothing more than what the evening required. And that, perhaps, is where this story rests for tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way all old houses do, quietly, without ceremony, folding back into the dark. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take it. Let your breath come slow and easy, in through the nose, out through the mouth, your body growing a little heavier with each exhale. The night is long, and it belongs entirely to you. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, a small apartment, a rainy evening, the sound of water moving gently against a window pane, and it will find you exactly where you are, whenever you are ready to follow. Somewhere in the slow middle of that autumn, when the mornings held a soft and milky light and the afternoon smelled faintly of wood smoke and the dry sweetness of fallen leaves, a young person named Icky had been carrying a secret that felt too large for the body that held it. The weight of it was not sharp, not the way one might imagine such a weight. It was more like the weight of still water, filling the chest slowly, calmly, without fuss, without any particular urgency. Several weeks had passed since the doctor had spoken the words that no one wishes to hear, words about time remaining, about months rather than years, and Icky had listened very carefully to those words, nodding at the right moments, folding the information away in some interior drawer that had not yet been fully opened. The family did not know. This was a decision made not from cruelty, but from a certain and considered kind of love, the sort that understands how a household changes when a word like that enters it, how every meal becomes weighted with unspoken meaning, how every ordinary goodbye becomes something else, something heavier than it was before. Icky had decided, quietly and without ceremony, to live inside the ordinary for as long as that was still possible, to drink morning tea without anyone watching with careful, unhappy eyes, to sleep beneath the familiar futon without being tended to like something fragile and already half gone. It was a Thursday when Icky went to visit the grandmother's house, a small wooden house at the far edge of a residential neighborhood in the older part of the city, the kind of house that still had sliding shorgy screens and a garden so narrow it was more like a memory of a garden than the actual thing. The walk from the station took perhaps 10 minutes, through streets that were lined with the kind of modest and slightly weathered buildings that have been standing long enough to feel entirely settled, as though they had grown there rather than been constructed. The autumn leaves on the sidewalk made a soft, dry sound underfoot, and the sky above the rooftops was a pale and even grey, the kind of sky that holds neither rain nor sun but simply continues, vast and uncommitted, above whatever is happening below it. The front gate of the house was old and required a particular lift and push to open, a gesture that Icky had learned as a child and had never forgotten, a motion carried entirely in the wrist and shoulder, below the level of thought. The tatami in the main room smelled of age and cedar oil and the faint sweetness of something dried, chrysanthemum, perhaps, or the memory of it, a smell Icky had known since early childhood, one that lived not in ordinary memory but in the body itself, in the part of the body that recognizes home before the mind has had a chance to name the feeling. Grandmother, Obakan, she had always been called, the word carrying its own particular warmth, its own closeness, was 79 years old that autumn, and she moved through her days with the particular slowness of someone who has stopped being in a hurry because she has understood, at last, that time offered unhurried attention tends to give more back than it takes. She was sitting near the low table when Icky arrived, her small hands occupied with the careful folding of a cloth she had washed and left to dry in the pale and thin sun of the window, the afternoon light falling across her in pale diagonal stripes through the curtain's weave. They greeted each other in the way of people who are entirely comfortable, where the greeting need not be elaborate, a simple meeting of eyes, a small lowering of the head, the feeling of a door opening between two rooms that have always been connected by more than walls or proximity. Obakan asked whether Icky had eaten, and Icky said yes, and this small exchange had the texture of every exchange they had ever shared across 30 years of visiting, across childhood meals and summer holidays and the ordinary, unmemorable, entirely irreplaceable coming and going of family life. There was rice warming in the small pot on the stove, and the kettle was beginning its low and unhurried song on the gas ring, and the whole afternoon felt, as afternoons in small wooden houses so often do, like a room apart from the rest of the world, where the usual speed of things had been gently suspended. Icky settled onto the cushion on the tatami and felt the familiar slight give of it, the particular quality of sitting close to the floor that this kind of room provides, a quality of groundedness, of being held by the earth itself through the thin and fragrant layers of straw. They sat across the low wooden table from one another, and the conversation began in the usual way, questions about the weather, about the train, about the work, about a small neighborhood matter that Obakan had been meaning to mention for a while. Icky answered everything carefully and honestly, finding that the ordinary questions were a relief, a place where the mind could rest without pretending, and sat with both hands wrapped around a warm cup of hojika, the roasted tea sending up a thin and steady ribbon of steam that dissolved almost at once into the cool and still air of the room. Outside, a crow called once from somewhere in the narrow garden, unhurried and low, and then went quiet, and the quiet after it was slightly more complete than the quiet before it. The sound of the street, a bicycle bell, the distant passing of a car, the voice of a child too far away to be distinct, filtered through the shoji in a way that softened everything, that made the world outside feel both real and very far removed from this particular room. After a while, Obakan began speaking about her neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived 3 houses down for many decades and who had been taken to hospital the previous month with something the doctors were not entirely certain about, something to do with the lungs or perhaps the heart. Obakan had not asked too many questions, because some things, she had always felt, did not require more definition than they already possessed. She spoke about this in the way that older people sometimes speak about illness in others, not with fear, exactly, but with a kind of calm attentiveness, as though she were reading signs in the weather and making careful note of them in a journal she kept only in her memory. The neighbor was not doing well, Obakhan said, and then she added, softly and without drama, that this was the way of things, and she offered this phrase as though it were simply a fact she had known for a long time and was only now finding the right occasion to say aloud. Ikki listened without moving, without tightening the hands around the warm cup, simply breathing and listening and willing the body to remain open rather than closed, present rather than gone somewhere ahead of itself. There was a quality to the afternoon light that seemed to slow everything further, the mote of dust made visible in the slanted beam that came through the curtain, the way the steam from the teacups moved in slow and unhurried spirals, the sound of a bicycle somewhere on the street, distant and light and then gone. Obakhan refilled both cups without being asked, and this small gesture, the tipping of the old iron kettle, the quiet and patient sound of the tea entering the ceramic, felt to Ikki like something deserving of attention, the kind of moment that does not announce its own importance but that the mind, without being instructed, files away among the things that matter. And then, in the gentle and entirely unhurried way that conversation sometimes moves in the late afternoon between two people who have no argument with silence, Obakhan began to speak about herself. She said that she had been thinking about things lately, and she offered this phrase with the lightness of someone who has been sitting with something for a long while and has decided that today, in this room, with this tea, was the right time to set it on the table between them. She said that at her age, one begins to think about what remains, and what has been done with the years, and whether it had been enough, whether the children had grown in ways that felt true to themselves, whether the house had been a good place, whether the garden had given enough flowers over all its seasons combined. Her voice was very calm as she said this, low and level and unhurried, the voice of a woman who has arrived, over a long lifetime of small arrivals, at a particular relationship with time, and has found it, if not without difficulty, then at least navigable, at least something one can sit across from. She spoke about Ikki's grandfather, who had died 12 years before, and she said that she thought of him most mornings now, not with grief, she was careful to say, not with the sharp and particular grief of early loss, but with a companionable awareness, as though over the years since his absence he had quietly moved into the fabric of the house, into the cedar smell and the winter light and the space between the old beams. She said that she had not been afraid for some time now, and this she offered not as comfort or as something meant to be reassuring, but simply as a piece of information about how things stood, the way one might report the morning temperature. She set her cup down gently on the surface of the low table. Ikki sat very still. It was one of those moments that opens up much larger than the room can properly contain, a moment in which two things exist simultaneously, the small domestic afternoon with its warm cups and its cedar smell and its pale slant of light, and something else, something vast and patient, pressing very quietly in at the windows. The hodjika had grown slightly cool, and Ikki drank a small and careful sip and found that the faint bitterness of it was appropriate to the moment, was something that matched what the body was holding, was something that could be received without resistance. There was something forming deep in the chest, not quite tears yet, not the sharp and arriving kind, but the slow and underground kind that begin very far down in the body and rise without urgency, following a current that has no name but that the body has always known how to recognize. Obakhan was not finished, she said, turning the folded cloth over slowly in her small hands with the particular mechanical comfort of someone who thinks more clearly when her hands have something gentle to do, that she hoped the family would not be too sad when the time came, because she had been thinking about it carefully over many quiet mornings, and she believed the time would not feel to her like an ending, not in the way that endings feel in stories, but more like a door she had been walking toward for a while, a door that was simply becoming more visible as she continued walking. She said the door had no particular color in her mind. This detail seemed important to her, and she returned to it once, in the way people return to details that are not decorative but structural, not ornamental but true. It was just a door, ordinary wood, the kind of door one opens many thousands of times across a life without giving it any particular thought. She said she was not in a hurry. Icky found, sitting in that low-lit room with the cedar and the warm tea and the thin sound of the street filtering through the shorgy paper and the pale afternoon becoming something slightly softer, slightly less definite than afternoon, that it was no longer possible to keep the inside separate from the outside. The tears came, not the performative kind, not the kind that arrives for an audience and requires a response, but the involuntary kind, the kind that comes not because a decision to cry has been made but because the body has made the decision quietly and on its own, and all the mind can do is receive it, the way a room receives rain. There was no sound to them, no movement in the face beyond the slow welling, the overflow, the wet warmth on the cheeks that the cool air of the room then met. Oberkan noticed, she had been watching this particular face across the whole arc of a lifetime and could not have failed to notice, and she did not make a sound, did not lean forward, did not reach across the low table with a tissue in the well-meaning way that can interrupt and redirect what a body most needs to release, but simply remained where she was, folding the cloth, giving the tears the quiet and complete permission to be what they were for as long as they needed to be. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was not the silence of discomfort but the silence of two people standing in the same place at the same hour, looking at the same thing from angles that were different and could not be exchanged. Icky thought about what it would mean to speak, to say aloud, in this warm and cedar-smelling room, the words the doctor had spoken, to carry those words across the low wooden table and set them down there among the cups and the cloth and let them exist in the shared air of the room rather than only in the body. And then Icky thought about the door with no particular color, about the ordinary wood, about walking toward something for a long time until it simply becomes visible, about not being in a hurry. There was a long and undemanding breath. When Icky finally spoke, it was only to say that the tea was very good, that the room was warm, and that it was good to be here, in this house, on this particular Thursday afternoon, in this light. Oberkan looked up from her folding and offered the small and deliberate smile of someone who has understood something without being told it, who has received information through a channel that requires no words, and she said that yes, she agreed entirely, it was very good to be here. And she set the folded cloth down at the center of the low table, where it rested between the two cups like something that had finally found its place. The afternoon continued to move around them as afternoons do in old wooden houses, slowly, with the patient and unhurried attentiveness of water finding its level, filling the low and quiet places first. The light through the curtain shifted by degrees from its pale autumn gold to a softer and more diffuse gray, the first sign of evening beginning its gentle approach, and the kettle was refilled and the tea made once more, and Oberkan told a long and wandering story about a small grey cat that had been visiting the narrow garden for several months without invitation. The cat had no collar and appeared to belong to no one in particular, and it had very specific and apparently fixed ideas about which stone on the step was the correct stone to sit upon and at what hours of the day, and it had never once come inside the house despite several quietly extended invitations. Icky listened to the story of the cat, and thought genuinely about the cat, and found that the thinking was real and present. The small grey cat with its particular preferences was an actual and current interest, not a distraction from something more important but interesting in its own right, and this discovery felt, in some small and quiet way, like a gift. They spoke for another hour, or perhaps a little longer, about the neighborhood and about a cousin's recent wedding and about a television program Oberkan had been watching, a program about the restoration of old farmhouses in the Tohoku region, farmhouses with irori hearth sunk into the center of their floors, the ceilings above them darkened by generations of smoke from fires that had kept people warm through the long mountain winters. Oberkan said that she had always wanted, just once, to stay in a place like that, an old mountain farmhouse, just for a single night, to sleep beneath the heavy and smoke-dark beams and hear the mounting cold pressing at the walls while the fire settled slowly to embers inside, the warmth of it a different and deeper quality than any other warmth she had known. Icky said that this sounded like a very fine way to spend a night. Obakan agreed, and looked genuinely pleased, and poured the last of the tea with her small and entirely steady hands, and the act of pouring was itself a kind of grace, the ordinary gesture of a life lived with attention to the small and available things. When it was finally time to leave, they stood together in the narrow Genkan, the small entryway of the house, scuffed and worn and lined with the accumulated and orderly archaeology of many decades of shoes, and Obakan took Icky's hands in both of her own, which were small and very warm, the skin loose and fine in the way of hands that have spent many decades in the company of work and water and the things one holds across a full life. She did not say anything for a moment, only held the hands and looked, with her steady and dark eyes, at the face she had known since it was an infant's face pressed against her shoulder in the summers of decades ago, and what lived in that long and unhurried look could not have been converted into language without losing the greater part of what it was. Then she said, simply and without particular weight, that Icky should come again soon. And Icky said yes, soon, and meant it in the way one means a thing when the meaning has traveled all the way through the body before arriving at the words. On the train home, Icky sat by the window in the last of the day's light and watched the city pass in its familiar arrangement, the lit rectangles of apartment windows, the warm blurred neon of small storefronts, the dark geometric shapes of overhead wires making their slow arcs across the dimming sky. The weight that had been sitting in the body for several weeks had not lifted, exactly, that was not quite the right word for what had happened, but it had shifted, had distributed itself differently, as though someone had picked it up with care and set it back down in a slightly altered position, one that the body found more possible to carry. It was still present, but it was held differently now. Icky sat with both hands resting open on the lap, palms upward in the way that one sits when one is not holding anything tightly, and watched the city pass and thought about the door with no particular color, and about ordinary wood, and about walking toward something for a long time until it simply becomes visible, and found that these were thoughts one could sit with without demanding resolution from them. The train moved into a tunnel, and for a moment the window became a dark and still mirror, and Icky saw a face looking back from that mirror, composed, a little tired, the eyes still faintly swollen from the afternoon, but also something else, something that was difficult to name but that had the quality of having spent several hours in the presence of a steady and particular light. The tunnel ended and the mirror became a window again, and the city spread itself out in the blue and gold of early evening, vast and illuminated and entirely itself, and Icky watched it with the attention of someone who has been reminded that the world continues to repay attention. In the small wooden house at the edge of the neighborhood, Obakan was most likely washing the cups by now, setting them carefully to dry on the rack beside the kitchen sink, the thin sound of water running, the cloth folded neatly on the counter beside the kettle. The small grey cat was perhaps at the garden wall again, occupying its preferred position on the stone step with the quiet and unhurried authority that cats bring to the business of simply being where they are. The family would not know yet, and there would come a day when they would, and that day would be its own kind of afternoon, its own particular and irreversible quality of silence, its own cups of tea set between people who loved each other and did not know how to say all the things that needed saying. But that was for another season, another arrangement of afternoons yet to come. Tonight there was only this, the train, the window, the city softening into evening, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a feeling that was not exactly peace but was something neighboring it, something that shared with peace the quality of stillness, of no longer requiring the world to be other than it was. Somewhere in the past few hours, some deep and silent thing had rearranged itself without any announcement at all, and it had felt in the end less like sorrow than like a kind of companionship, the companionship of being understood without having to explain, of sitting across a low table from someone who has walked further along the same road and has found it, if not without difficulty, then passable, then something a person can continue moving through. The lights of the city blurred softly in the glass as the train gathered its quiet speed, and the whole of the afternoon, the cedar smell, the hojika, the small grey cat of the garden, the folded cloth resting between two cups, the hands that were warm and soft and had held so many things across so many years, settled down into the quieter and more permanent layers of memory, into the place where the things that matter tend to settle. And that, perhaps, is where this story rests tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its shadows settle back into stillness, into the quiet it was always meant to hold. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one, let your breath slow, let your shoulders soften against whatever is beneath you, let the weight of the day grow a little more distant. The night is long and unhurried, and so are we. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, to rooms filled with the small, ordinary sounds of a family at rest, the creak of old wood, the distant hum of a refrigerator, the particular silence that settles only when everyone who matters is safely home. We will arrive there gently. There is nowhere else to be. She lay in the narrow hospital bed, her body heavy and still, the thin cotton sheet pulled to her chin in the cool, close air of the maternity ward. The light that came through the window was soft and milky, settling on the pale walls without demand or insistence, neither fully morning nor fully night. Somewhere along the corridor a monitor hummed at a low, measured pitch, and the sound of slow footsteps passed outside her door and faded, and the ward returned to its familiar, encompassing silence. She had not slept well, or perhaps she had slept in the way that sadness allows, slipping under for a few minutes and surfacing again, over and over, through the long and soundless hours. Her husband was somewhere nearby, she knew, waiting in the small family area along the corridor, and she was glad, in a worn and wordless way, that he had not gone far. The previous afternoon, in the pale light of early autumn, her daughter had been born by caesarean section, small and pale and briefly held before the nurses carried her gently to the nursery with its warm and steady lamps. Even that brief holding had been enough for something to bloom in her chest, something new and wordless and enormous, and yet underneath it, very soon after, a darker current had begun to move. She had looked at her daughter's small face for those few and careful moments and felt, alongside the love that surprised her with its swiftness, the beginnings of something that felt like failure. She had spent most of the night not sleeping but turning the same thoughts over and over, the way a hand turns a smooth stone, finding no new surface, no different edge, nothing it had not already found. Several weeks before the birth, when it became clear that the baby was not going to turn from her breech position despite everything that had been tried, the doctor had spoken to her gently and without hesitation. He had said that there was no good reason, under these particular circumstances, to insist on a natural birth, that the safer and more sensible path was a caesarean, and that she should not think of this as anything other than a careful choice. She had nodded and had gone home and had tried to feel the certainty that his words seemed designed to produce, and had found instead that the certainty was slow and reluctant to arrive. Her own mother, when she shared the news, had said something that was perhaps intended as concern but landed quite differently, had said that caesarean birth meant missing something essential, something that made a woman truly a mother. A colleague from work, a woman she had liked and trusted through several years of shared lunches and easy conversation, had said something similar on the telephone, in the mild and offhand way of someone who does not understand the weight their words are carrying. She had not argued with either of them, because what she felt was not exactly disagreement, it was something softer and more stubborn than that, a doubt she could not reason her way out of, no matter how many times she tried. She understood, with the part of her mind that dealt in facts, that caesarean births were common and safe and sometimes necessary, that countless women had gone through them and loved their children no less fiercely. But the part of her mind that listened to fear, and to the quiet voices of people she had trusted, was not on speaking terms with the calm and reasonable part, and had not been for weeks. By the morning of the birth she had felt very still, not at peace, exactly, but past the particular kind of anxiety that moves, arrived somewhere that was simply awaiting without hope or dread. Now, in the morning after, her body aching in the low and persistent way of surgical recovery, she lay looking at the ceiling and thinking about her daughter sleeping in the nursery down the hall. The baby was small, smaller than most of the others in the ward, and when she had stood at the nursery glass and looked at the row of bassinets, the difference had been quietly and undeniably visible. She had looked at her daughter's small wrapped form and felt the love and the inadequacy together, two things that should not have been so intertwined but were, at least on that morning, inseparable. She had cried through most of the night, not with great noise, but with the kind of steady and persistent weeping that comes when grief is not sharp but simply wide, like a mist rather than a rain. By morning her eyes were swollen and her pillow was faintly damp, and she lay without moving because stillness felt like the closest available substitute for comfort. She had not thought much about her mother-in-law's visit, though she knew the family would come. That was expected, that was the natural way of things, and she had no strong feeling about it in either direction. Her mother-in-law had been a part of her life for several years now, and in all that time she had learned very little about the woman's interior world, because Tome did not make her interior world available. When they had first met, when she had bowed and introduced herself with all the formal phrases the occasion required, Tome had replied with a brief and flat syllable of acknowledgement and looked away. Her husband had tried to explain this, had said his mother had always been quiet, had always kept whatever she felt well behind a face that showed almost nothing, and she had accepted the explanation and adjusted accordingly. She had learned to move around Tome the way one moves around a quiet room, without expectation of response, neither hurt by the silence nor particularly troubled by it, simply accepting its presence as a fixed condition. Her father-in-law was everything Tome was not, warm and sociable and full of easy laughter and ready enthusiasm, and she had always wondered, in a fond and mildly puzzled way, how these two people had come to share a life. When the pregnancy had been announced, her father-in-law had celebrated with the warmth of someone who had been waiting for precisely this news. Tome had said something brief and returned to whatever she had been doing. It was mid-morning when Tome arrived, carrying a paper bag and a small bundle of flowers wrapped in tissue paper, her footsteps unhurried on the linoleum of the corridor. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the woman in the bed, at the swollen eyes, the pale and still face, the particular heaviness of someone who has been awake in sorrow, and she said nothing at all about any of it. She set the flowers on the small bedside table without ceremony, then opened the paper bag and began, in her efficient and wordless way, to unpack a few things onto the chair beside the bed. There were soft harnesses for the baby, folded neatly in pale cotton. There were a few small items for practical comfort, and there was, unmistakably, the quiet sense of someone who had thought carefully about what would be needed. Tome did not ask how the birth had gone, did not offer the reassuring phrases that people reach for in hospitals when they do not know what else to say. She simply began to do what was necessary. She asked, in her abbreviated and flat manner, whether there was laundry to collect, whether anything was needed from outside, whether there was something particular that might be wanted to eat. She listened to the answers and moved around the small room with practiced and unhurried efficiency, setting things in a quiet order, her hands moving with the calm of someone who had already decided what the situation required. The woman in the bed watched all of this in a tired and half-present way, thinking somewhere in the back of her mind that even now, even here, Tome did not feel the need to say anything kind. and then her gaze drifted, without particular intention, to the flowers being transferred from their tissue paper into the small hospital vase, pale purple asters, small and clustered, nodding slightly with the movement. They were not the kind of flowers one chose without knowing someone's preference, not the generic arrangement from the gift shop, not the obvious default that required no particular thought at all. She looked at them for a moment without fully understanding what she was looking at, and then the understanding came slowly, the way things come when the mind is tired and must work through layers to reach the surface. A memory surfaced of a conversation with her father-in-law, an easy and wandering afternoon exchange, in which she had mentioned without emphasis that she liked this particular flower, pale purple asters, this exact shade and size. She had said it once, in passing, as a small detail in a much longer conversation, the kind of thing that is said and then dissolves into the afternoon without leaving any traceable mark. At the time, she recalled now, Tom had been at the kitchen counter, making tea, perhaps, or doing something quiet near the window, and had given no sign of listening. She had assumed, as she always assumed, that Tom was elsewhere in her attention, that the exchange was happening in a space Tom simply did not inhabit. But someone had gone to a shop, had looked among the arrangements, had found these particular pale asters, had wrapped them with care, and had carried them through the hospital corridor to this small room. Her eyes moved from the flowers to the folded baby clothes on the chair, and she found herself looking more carefully at the small printed design on the soft fabric. It was a little illustrated creature from a storybook series she had once mentioned finding charming, mentioned only once, in a conversation she would have said left no impression on anyone. She lay very still, looking at the flowers and the baby clothes side by side, and felt something shift inside her, something quiet, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a very long time. The tears came before she had decided to cry, and they were different from the tears of the long night. Those had been about inadequacy and borrowed shame and other people's verdicts. These were something she had no ready word for. Tom noticed, and paused in her arranging of the flowers, and there was a brief and held stillness in the small room in which neither of them said anything at all. And then Tom came to the side of the bed and placed one hand on her daughter-in-law's back, not a brief pat but a sustained and quiet warmth, held there without hurrying, without withdrawing. It was the most physical comfort Tom had ever offered her, and the unexpectedness of it was part of what broke something open, and she found herself speaking through tears, saying things she had not planned to say. She told Tom what her own mother had said about caesarean birth and real motherhood, and what her colleague had said on the telephone in that offhand and unthinking way, and how those words had lodged in her and grown heavier with every passing week. She said it all in a rush and without much order, the way speech happens when the pressure has been building too long and the release comes without warning, and when she was finished she was certain she had made a mistake. She thought, this is not the right person to say these things to, this is a woman who finds words difficult, this is someone who will not know what to do with what I have just placed in front of her. But Tom was quiet for only a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was exactly what it had always been, flat and unhurried, but the words it carried were unlike any she had used in all the years this woman had known her. She said that caesarean birth was not a thing to be ashamed of, said it plainly, as one might state the day of the week, with no room in the sentence for argument or revision. She said that how a child came into the world was not a measure of the mother, not of her love, not of her worth, not of any quality that had any bearing on anything that came next. And she said that anyone who would make a new mother feel small for the way her child was born was not someone whose opinion deserved the weight it had been given, and that she, Tom, would not be accepting such a position on behalf of her family. And then she said, "Congratulations, you are a mother now." The woman in the bed raised her face, still wet with tears, and looked at her mother-in-law, and Tom was looking back at her, and for the first time, truly the first time in all the years they had known each other, Tome was smiling. It was a small smile, the kind that does not remake a face so much as reveal what was always underneath it, patient and genuine and waiting for the right moment to surface. In the days that followed, the memory of that morning settled into a different kind of knowing, not the dramatic kind that announces itself, but the quiet kind that you find you are returning to, without intending to, in the small spaces between other thoughts. Her father-in-law visited later that same afternoon, warm and easy as always, filling the small hospital room with his familiar presence, and she told him quietly, in a few words, what had happened. He nodded with the expression of someone hearing a story they recognize from the inside, not quite surprise, more the look of something confirmed, and he said that this was exactly who Tome had always been. He said she had always been this way, that expressing feeling directly had been genuinely difficult for her across her whole life, not from any absence of caring but from some structure inside her that made the outward expression hard to reach. He said that beneath the quiet, behind the flat voice and the brief replies, Tome thought about the people she loved more carefully and more persistently than almost anyone he had ever known. He said that when someone mentioned something they liked, something they hoped for or found beautiful, Tome would remember it, not because she made any particular effort, but because she was always listening, even when her face showed nothing. The woman turned this over in her mind alongside the image of pale purple asters and the small illustrated creature on the baby's first soft onacy, and felt something settle in her that had been loose and unresolved for a long time. She thought about how she had spent years reading silence as absence, had assumed that a person who did not respond in the usual ways was not present in the ways that mattered. She thought about how many small moments Tome might have been quietly receiving, how much attention might have been present in rooms where she had believed herself essentially unobserved. The baby came home from the hospital on a bright afternoon, wrapped in the soft white onacy with its small familiar print, and the house felt different, fuller, more inhabited, weighted now with something irreversible and good. In the weeks that followed, Tome began to appear at the house with a regularity she had not anticipated, arriving without elaborate announcement, moving through the rooms with her practiced and unhurried efficiency. She would hold the baby while the new mother rested, tend to the laundry without being asked, prepare something for the kitchen and leave it covered on the counter, and then she would go, quietly, the way tied with drawers, without insisting on being noticed. There was no expectation of gratitude performed in any particular form, no waiting to be thanked. Tome simply did what was needed and withdrew, and the help was real and steady and entirely without condition. The woman found herself listening for the sound of a gate at the front of the house, found herself looking forward to those visits in a way she would not have imagined possible in the years before the birth. One afternoon, having learned from her father-in-law that Tome was fond of a particular traditional confection from a small shop in a neighborhood where she had grown up as a girl, she went and bought a small and careful box. When Tome arrived that day and had finished whatever quiet and useful task had brought her, the woman asked if she might like to stay a little while and share the sweets. Tome looked at the box for a moment, and then at her daughter-in-law, and said thank you, only those 2 words, but spoken with a warmth that would have been entirely unrecognizable from the woman who had offered a single flat syllable at that first stiff introduction years before. They sat together at the low table, the baby sleeping in the next room, and ate the sweets in a companionable quiet that felt different from the silences between them before, felt, for the first time, like an agreement rather than a distance. The woman thought, sitting there in the soft and unhurried afternoon light, that she had long been mistaken about what knowing someone required, had assumed it was built of words exchanged and feelings stated aloud, had not considered that a different language might have been operating all along. She had been known, she understood now, had been listened to, quietly and without display, over years she had assumed were leaving nothing behind. What had grown between them was simply patient and unhurried, a form of care that expressed itself in a vase of pale purple asters set on a hospital table without a word of explanation, in a small illustrated creature on a newborn's first garment. In the next room the baby stirred, a small sound, neither cry nor word but something between, and then settled again into the long and even breathing of newborn sleep. The two women at the low table went still for a moment, both listening in the way of people who have staked something on the sleeping child nearby, and then they looked at each other. Tome offered that same small and private smile, the one that did not remake her face but revealed what had always been there, waiting beneath the surface, and the room held its quiet around them, and the late light moved slowly across the tatami floor. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, in that warm and unhurried stillness, in the shared sweetness on the low table, in the child breathing softly in the next room, and in the long patient love that needed no announcement to have been present, all along, from the very beginning. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows settling back into silence, the door closing quietly on everything that unfolded there. There is no hurry now. If you need to, take a slow breath in, and let it go just as slowly, feeling the weight of the pillow beneath you, the warmth of the blanket drawn close. The night holds nothing but stillness, and you are safe here inside it. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, a small home where the rooms are modest and the evenings tend toward the gentle, the ordinary, the kind of place where the windows fog a little in autumn and something always simmers on the stove. Rest a moment before we begin. She arrived on a morning in early autumn, when the air still held the warmth of summer but carried within it a first quiet suggestion of something cooler waiting just beyond the line of trees at the edge of the garden. Her name was Miyu, and she was small for her age, with large, dark eyes that moved slowly around the room as she entered, taking in the low table and the pale tatami and the smell of the house without revealing much of what she thought. Nozomi's mother stood near the genkan, the small entryway where shoes are left at the threshold of a Japanese home, wanting to move forward and yet sensing, even then, that stillness was what this particular moment asked of her. She noticed the way the child held her hands close to her sides, lightly curled, as though she had learned some time ago that it was safer to keep them near herself than to reach them out toward anything or anyone. Morning light lay softly along the floor in long pale shapes, filtered through the shoji screens, and somewhere in the kitchen the small kettle had begun its low, melodic murmuring. Miyu looked toward the sound of the kettle for a moment, and then her gaze moved on, and it was this, the small arriving and then retreating of her attention, that Nozomi's mother would later describe as the truest picture of who Miyu was when she first came into their lives. There had been careful conversations beforehand, careful not in the sense of being evasive but in the sense of choosing which truths to carry forward and which to set aside for now, the way one packs lightly for a long journey, bringing only what is needed for the road immediately ahead. The child had been told simply that she would stay here for a while, that this family would look after her, that she would have her own room and her own things and a girl named Nozomi, who was a few years older and who had been looking forward to meeting her. The room prepared for her was small and clean, with a new futon in a quiet shade of cream laid out on the tatami, a low wooden chest with a lamp set on top, a cup of water on the nightstand in case she woke thirsty during the night. These preparations said something without words, that someone had been thinking about this child before she arrived, that her comfort had been considered, that her coming was hoped for rather than merely managed. Miyu moved through the first afternoon like a small figure in an old painting, present but not quite settled, sitting in the corner of the living room with a picture book open in her lap, not reading exactly but maintaining the posture of reading, which was perhaps its own kind of shelter. Nozomi's father came home from work that evening and greeted her with quiet care, lowering himself briefly to her eye level before standing again, and Miyu did not look at him, but she did not pull away either, and the two adults noted this in the way of people who have learned to measure progress in very small increments. Dinner that first night was a gentle affair, the conversation light and close to the surface of things, the portions generous, the room warm with the smell of miso broth and the soft sound of bowls being set carefully down on the low table. Miyu ate everything, and when she finished she placed her chopsticks across the edge of the bowl in the way she had watched the others do, and Nozomi's mother, clearing the plates, allowed herself a quiet, private measure of relief. What surprised her most in those first weeks was not the child's silence around the adults, that much she had expected and prepared for, but the quality of attention Miyu gave to Nozomi from the very beginning, a watchfulness that was different from wariness, different from the careful blankness she maintained everywhere else. Nozomi was 4 years old, small and in nearly constant motion, with a habit of narrating her own activities as she moved between rooms, telling herself, in a low murmur, what she was doing and why, a sound that filled the house with something gentle and undemanding. She accepted the younger girl's arrival without ceremony, folding Miyu into her daily orbit the way water adjusts to a new shape in its path, not resisting, not making an event of it, simply rearranging itself around what was there. On the second morning, Nozomi sat at the low table with her crayons and, without looking up, pushed a blue one across the surface toward Miyu, and Miyu sat down beside her, and after a long and quiet moment she picked up the crayon. It was so small a thing, the picking up of a single crayon, and yet Nozomi's mother, watching from the doorway, felt something in her chest that had been held tightly for weeks release its grip, a slow breath let out after a long and careful holding. Children, she found herself thinking, carry a kind of simplicity that adults lose gradually over the years, a capacity to begin again without requiring the past to be explained or settled or accounted for first. Nozomi gave Miyu a soft, shortened nickname from the very first days, the kind of easy name that signals, without any fanfare, that someone belongs to you, and Miyu began to follow her older companion through the rooms of the house like a shadow that had at last found something to attach itself to. They were not alike in temperament, Nozomi open and forward, Miyu still and contained, and yet the difference seemed to create a particular balance between them, each supplying in abundance something the other held carefully in reserve. The bath-time routine settled itself over many evenings, with Nozomi going first and then describing the warmth and the foam and the small plastic duck at the edge of the tub in such fond, enthusiastic detail that it became, over time, simply impossible for Miyu not to follow. Learning that things could be counted on to happen the same way twice, and then again after that, Nozomi's mother believed this was what Miyu needed most in those early months, the slow and patient accumulation of evidence that the world would not shift without warning beneath her. There was the matter of the chopsticks, which became one of the memories she returned to most often in later years, not because it was a dramatic story but because of what it quietly showed her about the nature of trust. She had tried, on several gentle occasions, to teach Miyu the correct grip, demonstrating it on her own chopsticks, guiding Miyu's small fingers into position with slow care, keeping her voice as even as she could manage throughout, but Miyu would not look up, sitting with her gaze directed at the table, still and unreachable, present in body but somewhere else entirely in whatever part of herself she kept most protected. This was not stubbornness, Nozomi's mother understood, and it had nothing to do with her personally. It was a protective stillness that had formed in the child over years of learning that it was safer to make herself small and quiet than to trust what the adults around her were offering. So she stopped demonstrating and simply waited. It was Nozomi who, as happened so often in those years, found a way through without knowing she was finding one. One evening at dinner, Nozomi announced casually that she had discovered a better grip for the slippery pieces of tofu, and she showed it to Miyu slowly and without any air of instruction, the way one shares a useful discovery with a friend rather than imparts a lesson to a student. Miyu watched, and without any announcement picked up her own chopsticks and tried the grip, and Nozomi leaned over and adjusted one finger very slightly, saying only that it worked better when held this way. and Miyu tried again, and the tofu lifted and held, and Nozomi gave her the quieter of her two smiles, the one that said she had noticed and was genuinely pleased, without needing to make a ceremony of it. Later, after the girls were asleep and the house was still, Nozomi's mother sat alone at the kitchen table in the low light and allowed herself to cry a little, not from sadness, or not only from sadness, but from the particular release of an emotion that had been held for a very long time and had found, at last, the right moment to let itself go. She thought about the daughter who had not lived, the one whose brief nearness had left a shape in the air of certain rooms that she still felt on certain evenings, a gentle, persistent absence, a shadow cast by something that had never been present long enough to be seen clearly. She was careful not to tell herself that Miyu was a replacement for that daughter. She had promised herself from the beginning that she would not lay such a weight on the child, but she thought that grief and love could perhaps exist beside each other without one erasing the other, the way two different things can grow in the same soil without diminishing what the other is. Her husband came into the kitchen and sat with her without asking anything, and after a moment he refilled her tea, and they sat together in the soft light while the clock on the wall marked the slow passage of minutes with its small, steady sound. Autumn deepened, and the leaves outside the kitchen window moved through their slow change, green giving way to gold, gold to rust, and the house adjusted to its new shape the way that houses do, accommodating the additional pair of shoes by the door and the additional cup on the morning table and the additional voice filling the rooms. She noticed, in those weeks, that Miyu had begun to look up when someone entered the room, a small, upward movement of the eyes that said she had registered the arrival, that she was now tracking the people around her with something less like alarm and more like ordinary awareness. It was too small a change to mention to anyone, and she did not mention it, only noted it in the private ledger she kept in some quiet part of herself, a running account of small differences from how things had been. Winter came and the kotatsu was brought out from the storage closet, that low, heated table around which the Japanese family gathers in the cold months, sitting with their legs tucked underneath the warm blanket, cups of tea within reach, the room close and comfortable against whatever the dark outside was doing. Miyu sat a little outside the circle of the table at first, slightly apart in the way she had been slightly apart from everything since she arrived, but as the weeks passed she moved closer, and eventually she was simply part of the shape the family made around the table, no longer separate from it. Nozomi's father read aloud some evenings, choosing books with pictures for the girls, and Miyu would lean forward sometimes to see the illustrations, her hair falling across her face, a small sound escaping her now and then, something between a murmur and a laugh, when the story offered something she had not expected. These were small things, and Nozomi's mother collected them all. Spring arrived with the smell of plum blossom on the morning air and with it the preparations for the start of primary school, the large leather rando seru, the backpack that marks, in Japan, the beginning of this chapter of a child's life, becoming the main subject of household conversation for several weeks. Nozomi chose a deep red, traditional and confident, and Miyu, after a long and serious deliberation that neither adult rushed or interrupted, chose a pale blue that was almost grey, the color of early morning sky in the moments just before the sun is fully up. There was a photograph taken at the school gate on the first morning, the two girls standing side by side with their new backpacks, Nozomi grinning with her whole face, Miyu's expression smaller and more careful, but present, genuinely and unmistakably there. Nozomi's mother kept this photograph near the front of the family album she had started, and in the years that followed she would sometimes turn to it and sit with it quietly, finding in Miyu's careful face something she could not name but that felt, each time she looked, like a threshold being slowly and steadily approached. School brought its own terrain, and Miyu moved through it slowly, preferring to watch from a careful distance until she understood the shape of things, sitting at her desk during recess when the other children went out to the schoolyard. Her teacher's reports were gentle and precise, noting Miyu's attentiveness and steady effort while observing also her tendency toward solitude, and Nozomi's mother read these reports carefully, understanding what was written on the page and sitting quietly for a while with what was not. She spoke to Nozomi one evening while braiding her hair for bed, choosing her words with care, explaining that Miyu found it more difficult than other children to feel safe in new places and with people she did not yet know, and that this was not a flaw but a consequence of things that had happened, and that what Miyu needed most was simply more time. Nozomi listened with unusual stillness, her eyes on the middle distance, and said after a long pause that she understood, and that she had already been thinking about it. What she had been thinking turned out to be a series of direct and entirely characteristic interventions, appearing at the door of Miyu's classroom during breaks to introduce herself to Miyu's classmates with cheerful certainty, explaining that Miyu was her little sister and asking them, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, to be kind to her. She would sometimes lean out of her own classroom window during physical education held in the schoolyard below and call encouragement to Miyu across the general noise in a voice that carried clearly, and Miyu's classmates, charmed by the sheer warmth of this older girl, began to notice the quiet child they had not particularly paid attention to before. Nozomi's mother heard about these episodes from Miyu's teacher and could not always decide how to receive them. They were not quite the right approach, perhaps, but what she felt most clearly, underneath everything, was a warmth that had no real need of words. Her daughter had understood something early, without being taught, about the nature of love, that it is not always a feeling that arrives by itself but can also be a practice, a series of small deliberate choices made day after day, until they become indistinguishable from something that was always naturally there. The autumn of Miyu's first school year brought its own quality of afternoon light, low and golden through the kitchen window, and one day Miyu came home and sat at the kitchen table without going to her room as she usually did. Nozomi's mother was at the counter, the smell of dashi filling the kitchen with its particular warmth, and she continued what she was doing, the soft chopping, the water coming slowly to a simmer, and said nothing, simply letting the sounds of the kitchen keep the space between them company. After a while, Miyu said something quietly, almost to herself, about a girl in her class who had asked her to eat lunch together the following day, and the words arrived in the kitchen with the fragility of something offered for the first time, requiring a response that matched their weight, no heavier, no lighter. Nozomi's mother did not turn around immediately, only stirred the pot with a steady hand and said that she was glad, keeping her voice as ordinary and unhurried as she could make it. She heard Miyu exhale, a sound like something gently being set down, and then the scrape of a chair as she went to wash her hands before dinner, which was what this household did before eating, which was now what Miyu did too. This was what family felt like from the inside, she thought that evening, not any single moment of arrival or recognition but the quiet accumulation of shared habits, the gradual growing together of small daily rituals until the places where one life met another were no longer edges but simply continuations. By the end of that first year, Miyu had begun to use the word obeison, auntie, and now and then, testing it in the middle of a sentence, then using it more often, then using it without any particular weight, the way any word settles into ordinary use once it has found its proper place. Nozomi's mother never made a ceremony of the first time she heard it, only registered it as something that had been approaching for a long time and had at last quietly arrived, the way a season arrives, not on any particular morning but across many mornings, until one day you look outside and the world is simply different from what it was before. Looking back across the years, what she remembered most from that first long season of becoming a family was not the difficult moments, though there had been many of those, but the ordinary ones, the smell of rice warming in the afternoon, the sound of two children somewhere in the house, the particular quality of evening light on the tatami in late summer. She remembered the first time Miyu laughed without holding anything back, a full and unguarded sound, and how it had stopped her completely where she stood in the middle of what she was doing, the pure surprise of it, the simple gift of it arriving like that from out of a quiet afternoon. She remembered the evening Miyu fell asleep at the kitchen table over her homework, her cheek resting against the open notebook, and how she had carried her to her futon without waking her, and how Miyu had murmured something, already deeply asleep, in a tone that had the cadence of a name. She remembered the afternoons when Miyu would come and sit beside her on the veranda without needing anything, only being near, the two of them watching the light move slowly through the garden while the cicadas kept their long, unhurried, ancient song. These were not the memories of dramatic turning points or grand gestures, but of accumulation, of the quiet and patient work of building something that cannot be rushed into existence but must be allowed to arrive in its own time and in its own way. Families made in this way, she came to understand, are not made all at once or all together but slowly and patiently, the way a stand of trees grows, not by leaping upward in a single season but by sending roots steadily deeper, year after year, until what stands above the ground is held by something that no wind can easily move. And in that first long year, that was what they had all been doing, sending roots down, quietly, in the dark and the patient earth, doing the invisible work that would later allow everything visible and nameable and beloved to grow. The summers of those years had their own smell, warm wood and jasmine and the faint trace of mosquito coils burning somewhere down the street, and the windows were left open late into the evening, and the cicadas maintained their steady, ancient rhythm against the warm dark. She would stand sometimes on the veranda after the girls had gone to bed, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into night, a voice somewhere, a bicycle, the distant note of a passing train, and feel the house behind her as something real and filled, held together by whatever it was they had been building, day by day, since the morning Miyu arrived. It was not the family she had imagined in her younger years, not the large and easy family she had once pictured for herself, not arrived at by the uncomplicated path she had once assumed she would walk. But it was a family, shaped in equal measure by necessity and by love, and it was hers, and it was real, and the realness of it was what she felt most clearly in those quiet evenings on the veranda, in the warmth of the summer night, the house breathing steadily behind her, the children sleeping somewhere inside. And perhaps that is where we leave them tonight, in that particular summer, in that particular house, in that unrepeatable quality of warmth and light and ordinary grace, the four of them, in their different ways and at their own unhurried pace, learning slowly and together what it means to stay. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet secrets folding gently away like the last page of a letter you no longer need to hold. There is no hurry now. If you need to settle deeper into your pillow, to let your shoulders sink a little further, please do. The night is long and patient, and it will wait for you. Breathe slowly. Let the silence between stories be its own kind of rest. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, a place of ordinary rooms and ordinary light, where something small and true was noticed by someone who almost missed it entirely. But that can wait just a moment longer. For now, simply breathe. Somewhere in the warmth of an ordinary evening, in a household where the lights were always on and something was always simmering on the stove, a woman sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about how she had arrived here. She had known this family for so long, since the years when she was still a girl in middle school, that the word arrival hardly seemed right. She had not arrived so much as slowly settled, the way a leaf moves through still water, finding its place without effort or noise. Her name, in this telling, is simply the young wife, the woman who had been part of this household in spirit long before she ever signed her name in any register. She had met her husband when she was still young enough to carry a school bag on her shoulder, and from those earliest years she had made a quiet habit of spending more time with his mother than with him. His mother was a small, energetic woman with a laugh that filled whatever room she was in, the kind of laugh that started somewhere deep and arrived at the surface before anyone quite expected it. She had lived a life that would have made most people very still, very careful, very guarded, but she had chosen, instead, to become someone who smiled. By the time the young wife was old enough to understand what that choice had cost, she had already decided that she loved this woman with a particular and lasting devotion. The mother had lost her own parents in an accident when she was only 13 years old, left without them in the world before she had quite finished the work of growing. She had no close relatives to soften the edges of that early loss, no aunts or uncles who could take her in and make things feel ordinary again, and so she had gone out to work while she was still very young, stepping into the adult world earlier than anyone should have to. And yet, from everything the young wife could observe, the woman had carried that weight as lightly as she was able, choosing warmth wherever she found it, building her own version of family from whatever materials were available to her. She had married early, to a man who worked in the same office she did, and they had built something between them that was quiet and sure and full of small daily kindnesses. When her second child was still growing inside her, her husband became ill in that gradual and implacable way that serious illness sometimes has, and before the baby could be held in his arms, he was gone. The young wife had heard this part of the story more than once over the years, and each time she heard it she sat very still, letting the weight of it settle somewhere low in her chest before the conversation moved on. The mother spoke of it without bitterness, simply and plainly, the way someone speaks of a road they have walked so many times that they no longer feel the individual stones beneath their feet. After her husband was gone, she had made a decision, and the decision was to become a nurse, and she had done exactly that, raising her children while studying and working and continuing, through all of it, to find time to laugh. She had studied in the evenings after the children were in bed, and she had gone to her exams in the mornings, and she had graduated, and she had built a life, and through all of it the laugh had remained, undiminished. This was the woman the young wife had known since middle school, the woman whose kitchen she had wandered into with her school books under her arm on many an afternoon when she could have gone anywhere else. She had, by her own honest accounting, gone to that house far more often than she went to spend time with her boyfriend, and if anyone had pointed this out to her she would have nodded calmly and said yes, that was probably accurate. They had talked about everything together across those years, working through the confusion of late adolescence side by side, discussing career paths and quiet worries, the question of what one was meant to do with a life, and whether one was making the right choices. The older woman had listened with the kind of attention that felt like being held gently in place, and she had offered her thoughts without insisting, in the manner of someone who has learned over many years that advice tends to land better when it arrives softly. When the young wife's boyfriend eventually asked her to marry him, something rather unexpected happened in the conversation that followed. He had assumed, in the way that most people assume, that the woman he loved would want her own apartment and her own space, a life built at a comfortable distance from parents and in-laws, which is how such things are usually arranged. But she had looked at him with an expression he would later describe as utterly and disconcertingly calm, and she had said that she would only marry him on the condition that they lived together with his mother. He stood in place for a moment, at a loss for words, because everyone knows that in such conversations the concern is always about living apart, never about living too close, and he had prepared for entirely the wrong conversation. He came home and told his mother what had been said, and she listened with her head tilted slightly to one side, and then she laughed so hard she had to sit down and catch her breath. It turned out, as though the story had decided to be symmetrical about it, that a parallel conversation was happening on the other side of the family at the very same time. The son's younger sister and her husband had also had an unusual exchange around the subject of marriage, because the sister's husband had proposed and then mentioned, at nearly the same moment, that he hoped they might live near his own mother, which was not the expected arrangement and not what anyone had prepared for. The sister had looked at him with the same expression of gentle bewilderment that her brother had worn, and she had gone to tell her own mother what had been said, equally confused about what to make of it. The mother had listened to both stories, one from her son and one from her daughter, and had found them each equally extraordinary and equally funny, and had sat in her chair surrounded by her children's laughter and thought she was perhaps the luckiest woman in the whole neighborhood. The years that followed settled into their own rhythms, the way years do when they are good ones, accumulating quietly and without fanfare. There were grandchildren now, small and unhushed in the way of children who feel entirely at home somewhere and have no reason to modulate themselves. They had a habit of calling out to the older woman when she was in the bath, announcing themselves with varying degrees of formality before crowding toward the door, in the manner of children who have been told about privacy and have not yet decided to take the concept seriously. She would answer them through the steam and the sound of the water, warm and unbothered, and they would settle in the doorway like small animals finding a comfortable place, the young wife sometimes among them, one hand over her mouth to hold back laughter at something a child had said. On days off from work, the young wife would find her mother-in-law in the morning light and propose a walk, and they would go out together along whatever road suited the day, talking about nothing in particular and everything in general, moving slowly because neither of them was in a hurry. On other days it would be shopping, the two of them moving through the aisles of whatever shop they had chosen, consulting each other about things that did not really require consultation, enjoying the company. On still other days it would be a long slow drive out to somewhere quiet, where they might stop for tea and sit looking at the road for a while without saying much, which was its own kind of pleasure. The young wife had a gift for a particular kind of teasing, the sort that sounds like a small competitive challenge on the surface but contains, underneath it, a great warmth. When her sister-in-law's husband arrived for one of these outings, she would look at him with great seriousness and announce that her mother-in-law was already fully occupied for the day and he had not been included in the plans. Her own husband would hear this exchange and press his lips together and look at the ceiling, and the children would watch all of it with round interested eyes, not quite sure what the joke was but certain there was one. The sister-in-law's husband was, in fact, someone who came to visit the older woman on his own sometimes, sitting with her in the afternoon quiet when the house was largely empty. He had told people, more than once and with real feeling, that in those conversations he had found something he had been searching for without quite knowing he was searching, a kind of patient and steady attention that made him feel understood in a way that was uncommon. He said that she had given him, in those quiet hours, exactly the words he had needed at exactly the moment he had needed them, not grand counsel or long speeches, only the right words placed carefully in the right order. He kept this in his memory with such precision and such feeling that he could repeat what she had said almost word for word, years later, as though he had written it down immediately and read it over many times since. The young wife knew all of this, had heard the story retold in the way that very good stories accumulate warmth with each retelling, becoming richer and more certain the more often they are passed from person to person. She also knew that her mother-in-law had had offers over the years, that there had been people who had approached her with the possibility of a second marriage, quietly and with kindness. The older woman had declined them all, and the young wife had once found herself standing near enough to an open doorway to hear her explaining why, without meaning to eavesdrop and without being able to help it. She had said, in the easy and unhurried tone she used for nearly everything, that her husband had been a particular kind of person and she did not expect to find someone quite like him again, and that in any case her life was already very full. She had said that her son's girlfriend came by so often that the house was always lively, and that lively was what she preferred, and that this was more than enough. The young wife, standing in the hallway with that sentence moving through her, had felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nowhere particular to go, and so stayed there for the rest of the afternoon, keeping her company. Her husband knew, in the way that people know things they have never said aloud, how much this relationship meant to her, and he had told her once, with more open feeling than he usually permitted himself, that he was grateful she had chosen to love his mother so fully and so openly. She had cried when he said this, quietly and without trying to stop, and he had cried too, and they had both been mildly embarrassed about it in the familiar way of people whose feelings arrive larger than the words available to contain them. Some time later, the young wife sat down at the family computer one evening and found herself looking at the browsing history, and what she saw there made her stop and sit very still for a moment. Her mother-in-law had been reading an online thread about warm family relationships, the kind that circulates among people who share such things because they find them nourishing, and she had not only read it, she had left a comment, which seemed remarkable for someone who was rarely seen near a computer and had never expressed much interest in online things. The young wife sat with this discovery for a moment, feeling the particular tenderness of seeing someone private make themselves briefly visible in a public place, and she decided to wait for the right moment before mentioning it. On a morning when her mother-in-law was free from work, the young wife brought her to the screen and showed her quietly that the thread had been gathered and shared more widely, that many people across the country had read what was written there and had responded to it. The older woman sat down in front of the screen and read slowly, taking her time with each comment, and the young wife sat beside her and said nothing, letting the reading happen at its own pace. After a while, the older woman said that there were so many kind people in the world, and that learning this made her happy in a way she had not expected. She said that happiness seemed to grow the more you sent it out, that it did not diminish when shared but multiplied, which she had always believed but which it was good to see demonstrated. She looked at the screen and said that some of the things people had written reminded her of her husband, of the way he had expressed himself, and she said this without sadness, only with the soft wonder of someone who finds a familiar voice in an unexpected place. She said that she wished there were some way to thank everyone who had left a kind word, some door she could knock on or some address she could send a note to, and she was genuinely puzzled that no such mechanism existed. The young wife watched all of this and felt that she was in the presence of something she did not have a name for, something that lived in the space between gratitude and love and the quiet ache of witnessing someone good be recognized by people who do not know them. The older woman was so moved that she could not quite settle in her chair, and the young wife later described to her husband how his mother had seemed almost on the verge of dancing, which was an image that took them both a moment to stop laughing about. She had cried, and then laughed, and then cried again, and said thank you to too many directions at once, and the young wife had simply sat beside her and let the afternoon be exactly what it was, without trying to make it into anything else. In the days after that, the older woman bookmarked the thread and read it each morning before going to work, starting her day in that warmth the way one might start a day in a patch of good sunlight near a window. The young wife, writing about all of this later in her own quiet way, trying to put words to something she felt strongly, had wanted to explain what it was about this family that made it different from family she had known. She wrote that they had a particular gift she had not encountered before, a talent for noticing when something good had happened and saying so out loud, without embarrassment and without waiting. It sounded easy when described, she wrote, but she had come to understand that it was not easy at all, that most people let good moments pass without remark out of habit or shyness or the general busyness of days. In this family, if the rice turned out well, someone said so, and named the person who had made it, and thanked them, and the thanks was given back again. If a shirt felt comfortable on the shoulders, someone mentioned it, and added that this feeling was because of the person who had washed and folded it. When the sound of a familiar voice came through the front door at the end of a long day, someone in the house would say that it was a good sound, that the house sounded better for it. These small observations were always followed by something like thank you and by the quiet certainty that things were good because of the specific person nearby, not in general, but because of that person in particular. The young wife had written that this seemed simple and almost unremarkable when she listed it, and that she had not understood how much it mattered until she noticed what it had done to her, how it had made her more willing to be honest, more willing to receive care without deflecting it back. The children had grown up breathing this atmosphere and wore it naturally, the way children wear everything they are raised inside of, without knowing it is something they are wearing. The grandchildren followed the older woman through the rooms of the house with the complete confidence of people who are entirely certain they are wanted and welcome, trailing after her like small planets around a steady and familiar sun. She received all of it with the same open-handed warmth she had always offered, as though there were simply no upper limit to the amount of affection she could hold without being burdened by it. On an evening not long before these words were written down, the young wife had been moving quietly through the house in the fading light, and had paused near the small altar where the family kept their photographs and their flowers and their candles. The older woman was there, speaking in a low and unhurried voice, as she sometimes did when she felt closest to the people she had lost, the people whose photographs sat on that shelf in their small frames. The young wife did not step forward or make herself known, but she stopped where she was and listened, and after a moment she took out a small notebook and began writing down what she heard, wanting to keep the words exactly as they were. The older woman was speaking about the people online who had left kind words, about how their responses had felt like gifts she had not earned and had not expected. She said that it felt strange and genuinely wonderful, at her age, to receive so much kindness from people who did not know her, and that she was not at all sure she deserved quite so much of it. She said that she was planning to go to the shrine before work the following morning, because she wanted to be grateful somewhere old and quiet, somewhere that had been holding people's gratitude for a very long time. She said, and this was the part the young wife pressed her pen harder to write, that she wanted to offer a prayer for the happiness of every person who had left a kind word, because happiness was the kind of thing that grew when you sent it outward rather than keeping it in place. The young wife closed her notebook and stood in the hallway for a moment longer, listening to the small sounds the house made around her as the evening settled in. Outside, the last of the light was giving itself over to the dark in that gradual and unhurried way of early winter evenings, the sky above the rooftops going from pale amber to a deep and quiet blue. Inside, the kettle was heating somewhere in the kitchen, the low sound of it steady and familiar, and the children were already in the other room doing whatever children do at the soft, slow end of a day. This is a family that grew from loss and from patience and from the ordinary willingness of people to be kind to one another in small ways over a very long time. There was no single great moment in this story, no dramatic turning point around which everything organized itself, only a long and unhurried accumulation of afternoons. A girl in middle school, wandering into a warm kitchen because she felt welcome there, and going on wandering in for the rest of her life, finding each time that the welcome was still there, unchanged. A woman who had learned earlier than was fair, that people could leave without warning, and who had decided from that knowledge to hold the people near her with care and with humor and with attention. A household where the lights were kept on and the door was kept open and someone was always, reliably, in the midst of laughing about something. The young wife had written that she did not know how to describe the feeling of belonging to such a family except to say that it felt like being allowed to breathe all the way down, without holding anything back, without bracing for what might come next. The older woman, for her part, would not have used such words or such length to describe it. She would have said simply that her house was full of good people, that she was very lucky, and then she would have gone to make tea for anyone who happened to be sitting down. She had gone to the shrine that next morning, as she had said she would, in the early light before the rest of the house was stirring, while the streets were still quiet and the air held the particular stillness of early winter mornings. The trees near the shrine would have been still at that hour, their branches barely moving, the sounds of the neighborhood muffled and very far away, the whole world seeming to hold its breath for a moment. She would have stood with her hands together in the way she had learned to stand in that place, the way one stands when one is very old friends with the act of being grateful. What she said in that stillness is not known, because no one was there to write it down, and some things belong to the morning and the quiet and no one else. But the young wife came home later that day to find her mother-in-law at the table with her usual expression, the one that settled the whole room a little the moment it appeared. And that, perhaps, is where this story rests for tonight, in the warmth of a table set for many, in the sound of a kettle and the low voices of children, and the long, quiet music of a family that chose, day after ordinary day, to be kind to one another. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet doors and dimly lit memories dissolving now like mist along a winter river. There is no hurry. If you need to rest here for a moment, between one story and the next, that space belongs entirely to you. Let your shoulders settle a little lower. Let your breath come slow, and unhurried, and easy. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, not a sharp memory, but a soft one, the kind that lives at the edges of a faded photograph, warm and a little bittersweet, the way all true tenderness eventually becomes. We will find our way there gently. There is nowhere else you need to be. Somewhere between the last amber light of autumn and the low warmth of her hospital room, the story settles now into its softest and most final chapter. She was smaller when he saw her in those last weeks, smaller in the way that something deeply loved becomes when winter draws nearer to it, quieter in outline, somehow more essential. Still, she smiled when he came through the door, smiled in the way she had always smiled, with her whole face at once, slightly delayed, as if happiness arrived in her a half-second after everyone else. She wore the hat he had given her on their anniversary, a soft wide-brimmed thing in navy blue, and from that day forward she had worn it to the exclusion of almost everything else. Her nature had not changed, not in the ways that mattered most. She was still the woman who had once ridden 7 hours on a series of slow local trains to his parents' house in Nagoya simply because she had refused to take the express. The Disney trip had come and gone in September, a single afternoon of 4 hours that both of them had been holding onto for longer than either had said aloud. Her father had driven them there and waited outside the park gates all afternoon, quietly, without complaint, and this small fact, a man sitting alone in a parked car outside a theme park, just waiting, moved the young man in ways he could not then fully explain. She could not ride any of the attractions, her body no longer steady enough for the motion, and so they had simply walked together through the soft noise of the crowds and found the bench near Cinderella's castle, the same bench where he had once knelt and, through 10 long minutes of fumbling embarrassment, told her for the first time that he loved her. They sat there and talked, and the hours moved around them the way hours do when two people are not watching them, without urgency, without any particular weight. She told him things she had kept to herself for a long time, that she had been the one to fall in love first, long before he had ever approached her at the volunteer event where they met, that she had asked a mutual friend to arrange an exchange of contact details, that she had never expected it to lead anywhere, because she had believed herself to be the kind of person things did not tend to lead anywhere for. He had listened to all of this without interrupting, sitting beside her on that bench, the late afternoon light falling sideways across the castle and turning everything around them the pale gold color of old photographs. When the 4 hours drew close to ending, when she said they probably needed to go back, she asked him to tell her again, to confess, in the way he had confessed on that same bench at the very beginning of everything between them. He said the words more easily than he had expected, without the stumbling or the reddened face of 3 years earlier, and she had laughed softly at how smooth it had come out, teasing him in the way she always did. He kissed her, and she held still for it, and he thought that of all the things he would carry for the rest of his life, this moment would be among the first to arrive when he closed his eyes in a quiet room. Her condition changed in October. The hours she spent lying down grew longer, while the hours she managed to sit upright grew fewer, and the grip of her hand when she held his became something lighter, something he had to be careful not to hold too firmly in return. She had begun, around this time, to ask him not to come. She said it gently, the way she said most things, with a kind of effortful brightness around the edges, but behind the words was something worn very thin, something she was using the last of her reserves to sustain. She told him one afternoon, in a voice drawn carefully through something narrow, that seeing him made her happy and that being happy, in the state she was in, had become exhausting in a way she could not fully explain. He understood this, or tried to, and it would be some time before he allowed himself to fully understand that her asking him to stay away was perhaps the most selfless thing she had ever done, her attempt to spare him from the particular weight of watching her disappear. He went anyway, most Fridays, arriving after the late seminars had ended and the campus had gone quiet, and she would say she was annoyed and then be visibly pleased, and the nurses had begun to know him by name. One of the nurses had mentioned to him, in passing, that she talked about him during the days he was not there, told stories from their time together, small ones, the kind that accumulate into something irreplaceable without anyone noticing while it is happening. She had told the nurse about the evening he had placed himself between her and two men at a train station, stepping into the space without a word and walking her away, though what he had privately felt in that moment was simply fear, not any particular courage, and he had moved without speaking because he had not trusted himself to speak. Still, she had told it as a love story, because to her it had been one, and hearing it return to him this way, through someone else's retelling, made it easier in the difficult weeks that followed to hold on to the knowledge that she had understood him more clearly than he had understood himself. The call came on a Thursday morning, while he was still in the examination room, his phone turned face down on the desk beside his notes, the room around him full of the careful silence of a presentation in progress. When he turned the phone over afterward and saw the many missed calls from her younger brother, the sheer number of them was enough to tell him, without any further information, what had happened. He reached her brother by telephone, and the brother was too distressed to form full sentences, and what came through the line was less information than sound, the sound of someone very young trying to locate a word large enough for what they were carrying. He explained to his professor that he needed to leave, that there was a family matter that could not wait, and within the next 20 minutes was on the train toward Yamanashi, the city moving past him through the window like something happening at a careful distance. When he arrived at the hospital, her mother and her brother were in the corridor, and her father was standing a little apart from them, jaw set, in the particular stillness of someone holding themselves together by not moving. He stood at the entrance to the ward for a long stretch of time, long enough that the quality of the light in the hallway seemed to shift, and then word came through, and the nurses moved with the particular quiet efficiency that hospitals reserve for these moments. He heard the phrase and understood it, though understanding and accepting are different things, and for a while he simply sat against the wall where he had placed himself and let the sounds of the ward move around him without trying to organize them. He had never before in his life experienced that particular giving way of the body, not a fall, exactly, but a settling, as if the body decides on its own that the floor is where it needs to be and lowers itself accordingly. The days that followed arranged themselves into a sequence he would later find difficult to describe in order, one thing leading to the next without the usual sense of time between them. He was included, without anyone quite deciding it aloud, on the family side of the funeral preparations, and this kept him in motion during the hours when motion was the only available alternative to something he did not yet have the language for. the structure of a Japanese funeral, the particular order of its rituals, the careful timing of each stage, the way responsibilities are distributed and quietly carried through, had the effect, he found, of holding grief at a certain remove while simultaneously treating it with great seriousness, and he moved through all of it with a gratitude he could not have expressed at the time. Her mother and her brother were not managing well, and so he and her father managed things between them, and there was a steadiness in her father's presence that reminded him, in the quietest possible way, of her. After the service was complete, when he went to the hospital to receive her belongings, one of the nurses placed 2 envelopes in his hands, one addressed to the family, and one addressed to him specifically, and explained that they had been found tucked inside the lining of a stuffed animal he had given her during one of her earlier stays. He carried his envelope home without opening it. It sat in the corner of his desk for several weeks, still sealed, while he submitted the final version of his thesis and received notice from his new employer and packed his apartment and carried boxes to the post office and did all the quiet administrative things that constitute the end of one chapter of a life before another one has quite begun. In the course of packing, he found several small objects she had left behind during her visits to his apartment, a compact mirror, a lip balm, a pair of hair clips in a small mesh pouch, and these he wrapped carefully in tissue and brought with him on his next trip to Yamanashi, to return to her family. Her parents' house in Yamanashi was a place he had come to know in a particular way, not quite as a guest, and not quite as family, but somewhere in the warm middle territory between those two things, which is a place that has no name but is recognizable when you are standing in it. He left the small wrapped parcel with her mother, and they drank tea together in the front room while the afternoon light moved slowly across the floor, and very little was said, because very little needed to be. Her parents had a way, he noticed, of speaking about her in the present tense in some sentences and the past tense in others, shifting between them without seeming to notice, and he found himself doing the same without correcting it in either direction. He read the letter in December, at his mother's house in Nagoya, on a night when the city outside the windows was very still and the glass had fogged slightly from the warmth held inside the room. His mother and his younger sister had gone to bed, and the house had settled into the particular quiet it reaches when it has held people for a long evening and they have finally rested. He sat at the low table in the living room with the letter in front of him, his hands slightly unsteady in the way hands become when the body is anticipating something that the mind is still trying to prepare itself for. There were 2 sheets of writing paper inside the envelope, the kind sold in stationery shops in small, neatly tied bundles, with pale blue lines and a faint printed pattern along the border. She had written to him directly, in the handwriting he knew well from the notes she had sometimes left on the counter of his kitchen when she had stayed over and he had left early for a tutoring shift, the characters a little crowded together, a little eager. She told him that she had wanted to marry him, that this was something she had thought about for a long time and had never found the right moment to say, and that seeing his name appear in the visitors' register week after week had been, she wrote, the thing she looked forward to most. She told him she was sorry for the times she had been unkind to him in her last months, that even as those words were leaving her, she had felt a sharp anger at herself for them, and had known that he would understand, and had been right about that, and had been grateful for it even while it was happening. She asked him to move forward, to live in the way that people are supposed to live, with the whole of their future still opening ahead of them rather than so much of it already behind. She told him that she had been happy, that the years of university, which she had entered tentatively and without great confidence in herself, had turned out to be the fullest years of her life, and that he was the reason for most of that fullness. She ended with something gentle and open-ended, that she hoped they might meet again someday, phrased in the way people phrase such things when they are leaving a door ajar rather than closing one, and signed her name in the small looping characters he had always been able to recognize from across a room. He did not cry while he was reading, The tears came some minutes after, slowly, in the way things arrive when they have traveled a considerable distance to reach you. His mother found him still at the low table the next morning and said nothing at all, only moved quietly to put the kettle on and then came and sat beside him, and the sound of the water beginning to warm was the only sound in the room for some time, and it was enough. A year passed, the way years do when a person is occupied, with the early demands of a new position, with the adjustments of a new city, with the accumulation of ordinary days that fill a life from the inside out, while the edges of grief, slowly and without any announcement, begin to soften. He continued to visit her grave in Yamanashi at intervals of roughly 2 months, bringing incense and whatever the market near the station had that seemed right for the season, and her parents usually had tea ready when he arrived, and her brother, who was becoming a young man now with his own particular shape, would sometimes sit with them. On the anniversary of the day he had first told her he loved her, the anniversary he and she had marked together on that Disney park bench, on the afternoon she had refused to take the express, he found himself once again on a train heading toward that same destination, this time traveling alone. He sat on the familiar bench outside the castle in the afternoon light, and the bench was there as it always was, unchanged, with the same particular quality of light falling across the stones that he remembered from every version of this story. The tears arrived before he was expecting them to, quietly and without much warning, and a young cast member in a bright uniform came over and asked him gently whether he was all right, and he said that he was, and she accepted this and withdrew with the quiet tact of someone who understands that a person sometimes needs only to be checked on and then left to themselves. He remained on the bench a little longer, until the afternoon began to cool and the sounds of the park shifted into the register of evening, and then he gathered himself and left, knowing, without needing to think it through, that he would come back. He told this story some time afterward, from the kind of distance that makes certain things possible to say without the words giving way beneath them, and he said he did not know how to end it except to say that he was still working on what she had asked him to do. He described the bench, and the letter, and the hat she had worn every day from the morning he gave it to her, and the way she had ridden 7 hours on local trains because she had decided she would not take the express, and each of these things was both a small detail and something that contained everything, in the way that the particulars of a life grow larger and larger only in retrospect. He mentioned that his handwriting had become a little neater in the years since she left, though he was not certain she would have believed him, given how often she had laughed at his grocery lists. He said that he was not yet where she had asked him to be, and could not say exactly when he would arrive there, but that on most days he was moving in that direction, and that this felt, for the time being, like enough. And so this story comes to rest here, in the quiet that follows everything, in the low light of a living room in winter, in the sound of a kettle beginning to warm on a cold night in Nagoya, and in 2 sheets of pale blue writing paper laid open on a low wooden table. In the memory of a bench outside a castle, and a hat in navy blue, and a woman who took the slow train because she had decided she would, and who loved the way she had decided she would, completely, without reservation, until the end. Some stories do not resolve so much as they continue, carried quietly forward in the lives of the people who were changed by them, who carry them the way you carry something you no longer notice the weight of. And that, perhaps, is where this one rests for tonight. And so we come to the end of tonight's stories. The voices have grown quiet now, the threads of each tale gently laid to rest, like letters folded and placed back in their envelopes. You have traveled far this evening, through other lives, other rooms, other moments of joy and heartache that somehow feel closer in the dark.